It is a pleasure for me to welcome you to the second panel of public evening lectures as part of our spring school, Religion and the Culture of Democracy, a cooperation of the Catholic Academy, Berlin, with the University of Virginia Forum on Democracy and the Furedi Protestant Institute for Interdisciplinary Research in Heidelberg. The main focus of our spring school is on figures of authority, people, text, traditions, and tonight we will debate liberalism's threshold, authority, and the authoritarian. Authority is almost something of a trigger concept in our contemporary liberal societies. One of the main reasons for this may be the historical experience with the authoritarian and totalitarian polities that are responsible for violence, mass murder, genocide, and destruction, and the collective memory of a widespread willingness to accept the establishment of leadership cults and to follow charismatic leaders has surely contributed to a disposition of skeptically questioning not only empirical claims of authority in the political and social arena, but to question the concept of authority itself, that has often been equated with the authoritarian and denounced as escape from freedom. On the other side, a merely negative concept of freedom as freedom from arrogated authority does not answer the question of what binds the members of a social body together. As we have seen yesterday evening in the discussion with Gerd Köhnen and Micha Brumlik, even the force of a better argument in a rational discourse cannot be explained without reference to at least some concept of authority. And if you trace discourse ethics back to its roots in Kantian practical philosophy, you will find that Kant's metaphors to describe the psychological effect of the moral law, bending one's inclinations under the Rationale of pure will, experiencing awe, eine ehrfurchtsvolle Scheu in meditating the moral law, are unmistakably located in the semantic field of authority. The current situation seems to be characterized by an unease in claiming intrinsic values that are essential to liberal democratic societies on the one hand, and a fear of cultural relativism in the face of renewed theopolitical challenges. The tension between essentialism and relativism in the self-understanding of liberal societies seems to be related again to a global revival of nativist and identitarian movements, and in its wake an increasing polarization of society. Against this horizon, questions arise such as how we have to understand and how we can respond to current forces of polarization. What do we learn from intra-religious and inter-religious dynamics of delegitimizing the authority of sacred texts, leaders, and institutions? Are there lessons offered for the cultural struggles in democratic societies? It is an honor for us that Professor Menachem Lorberbaum from Tel Aviv University and Professor Frank Furedi from Kent University have accepted our invitation to participate in the spring school and to offer us their presentations to the overall topic tonight. The idea of the evening is for each of our speakers to successively give a presentation of roughly 20 minutes. Then the floor will be open for discussion of both presentations, which will give both speakers the opportunity to react to each other, which has already taken place beforehand, and as well as the audience to comment on the presentations and to ask questions. But before we start, allow me to introduce our speakers to you and forgive me my heavy Teutonic accent. Professor Lorberbaum studied philosophy at the Hebrew University, where he wrote his dissertation about medieval Jewish scholars under the title Politics and the Limits of Law in Medieval Jewish Thought, Maimonides and Nissim Gerondi. He was the founding chair of the Department of Jewish Culture Studies at Tel Aviv University, where he currently holds a position as full professor. He's also fellow at the Shalom Hartman Institute in Jerusalem, which is the leading center of applied Jewish thought and education that offers pluralistic Jewish thought and education to scholars, rabbis, educators, and Jewish community leaders in Israel and North America. Professor Lorberbaum is co-editor of the Hebraic Political Studies Journal, has been on various editorial boards such as Until Present, the Interpretation and Culture series with Carmel Press, and the Global Political Thinkers series with Palgrave Macmillan. His research focuses in the widest sense on the role and relation of religion, state, and politics in the Jewish tradition, as it is documented in a book that goes back to his dissertation topic, Politics and the Limits of Law, Secularizing the Political in Medieval Jewish Thought, that has been published with Stanford University Press in 2001. Another book publication in Hebrew that has, unfortunate for me, so far not been published in English yet, has the wonderful title, Dazzled by Beauty, Theology as Poetics in Hispanic Jewish Culture. Menachem Lorberbaum has also edited, commented, and introduced the first complete translation of Thomas Hobbes' Leviathan into Hebrew. Important to mention is also the 3-volume edition of classical and modern texts of the Jewish political tradition, together with Michael Walzer and Noam Zohar with the Yale University Press. The first of these 3 volumes deals with the concept of authority and is therefore a reference work for our spring school. But Professor Lorberbaum also focuses on current political issues relevant for political philosophy, most recently in his extensive essay, That Mortal God, a theological critique of sovereignty, that has been published in Political Theology, the Journal of Christian Socialism, last year, a text that leads us right into the center of our debate. Here he deals with the modern concept of sovereignty and its potential function for the self-sacralization of the modern nation-state. A critical theology has the task, if I understand the author correctly, of somehow breaking the spell that is put on a polity by its nationalization dynamics and its strive for unquestioned sovereignty. Let me now turn to our second guest, to Professor Frank Furedi. He is Professor Emeritus of Sociology at the University of Kent and a public intellectual who writes for various periodicals in Britain and the US, from The Guardian to The Times, from Financial Times to Wall Street Journal, but also in Germany, such as in Die Welt or Die Zeit, as well as in digital formats such as Spiked Magazine or Novo in Germany. Professor Furedi received his PhD at McGill University for a work entitled The Mau Mau War in Perspective, that dealt with the 50s war between the Kenya Land and Freedom Army and the British colonial authorities. His research was initially focused on imperialism and race relations, involving monographs such as The New Ideology of Imperialism or The Silent War, Imperialism and the Changing Perception of Race. More recently, his research has also been oriented towards a sociology of risk, suggesting a completely different interpretation of modern political and social risk management than prominently Ulrich Beck in his Risikogesellschaft. He is also well known for his sociology of authority, having published a seminal study with Cambridge University Press on the historical development of the concept of authority from antiquity to modernity in 2013. This book examines how the modern world has become far more comfortable with questioning authority than with affirming it. Authority and the lack of authoritative orientation also play a role in his assessment of contemporary social and political tendencies. In How Fear Works, Culture of Fear in the 21st Century from 2018, published with Bloomsbury, he argues that one of the main drivers of the culture of fear is unraveling of moral authority. Fear appears to provide a provisional solution to moral uncertainty and is for that reason embraced by a variety of interests, parties, and individuals. But the provisional solution is two-faced, in as far as it is paralleled by a cultivation of helplessness and passivity that does not serve us well in the upcoming political challenges. Most well known in the wider public is Professor Furedi, probably for his critical stance on current educational methods and educational politics, such as in Paranoid Parenting, Abandon Your Anxieties and Be a Good Parent from 2001, or Wasted Why Education Isn't Educating with Continuum Press in 2009. The educational topic is also, I would say, something of a bridge between his studies on the idea of authority and his studies within the field of the sociology of knowledge and science. At least his most current of 25 books published last year with De Gruyter Publishing House suggests this. 100 Years of Identity Crisis, Culture War over Socialization. Here he argues that technocratic means of socialization found in psychological and behavioral research have extruded the authority of common sense that is embedded in cultural traditions of dealing with problems of everyday life. This extrusion has contributed to the spread of identity problems and concomitantly to the cultural conflicts over identities which shape Western societies nowadays. The focal point of all these thematically various studies seems to be a defense of democracy as an ideal in itself against a narrowing of its meaning by at least some of its liberal or neoliberal proponents. This leads him to the effort of discussing also non-liberal versions of democracy with fairness, such as the Hungarian model that he has dealt with 5 years ago in his book Populism and the European Culture Wars, the conflict of values between Hungary and the EU with Routledge Publishing House. I'm very much looking forward to your presentations and the discussion thereafter. Please, Professor Lorberbaum.
Thank you so much, Magnus. Hi, good evening, everybody. I want to begin by, first of all, thanking Stefan and Asha for this wonderful occasion, and it's so great to see you all here, and thank you for my friends that have made the effort to come. A proviso. I'm going to speak about, let me first say in a nutshell. Basically, what I'm trying to look at is what I consider the cleft between sovereignty and constitutionalism in the past decades in the modern republics, and take a close look at that. I'm going to speak about two polities that I know best, the United States, where I was born and grew up at least part of my life, and the state of Israel, where I live today. Thirdly, is that I am trained in philosophy, but I consider myself someone who's doing Jewish theology. And the place I speak from is from understanding that that the worst moments of our religions, whether Judaism, Christianity, or Islam, don't capture the best of these traditions, and try to keep that in mind. I think it's only from that kind of perspective that I could try to take responsibility for my own tradition, my own polity. So I'm going to speak from there, and that will allow me, I hope, to speak judiciously and critically about religious abuse of politics in our different polities. Okay, the founding of the American Republic was a decisive event in human political history. This country without a name showed that a democratic republic is politically viable, that democracy is not equal to anarchy, and showed for the first time that power can be transmitted from one elected executive to another without violence and spilling of blood. Covenanted constitutional procedure locates the generalized will of the public in the agency of normative process rather than lineage of dynasty and the person of the monarch. Sovereignty is institutionally placed, and the executive is in office. There were no doubt many fundamental problems left unresolved in the constituting of the American Republic. The parties agreed not to agree on critical questions that could potentially undermine federal unity. Slavery thus continued, not merely as individual property, but was enmeshed in the political economy of many of the former colonies. So too relations between the original states of the Union and the rest of the continent and its indigenous peoples remained opaque. Unsettled questions of boundaries, personal, economic, and territorial, would constantly return to haunt the public coming together in the polity and threaten to unravel it. Yet the basic insight of such early modern political thinkers as Hobbes, Spinoza, and Locke, that not personal virtues of individuals in power, but rather stable institutions transcending them and founded upon clear constitutions, make for a well-ordered and long-lasting polity, were shown to be viable. Fracturing sovereignty by division of powers and by federal structure diffused relations between power and right. The monarchic distinction between the king's two bodies, located in the majesty of sovereignty and thereby its legitimacy in the divine halo of the all-too-human individual upon whom it was bestowed and who exercised the power of the polity invested in him. The American Republic transposed the halo to the Constitution, understanding that the great power of the Republic that the Republic promises needs institutional machinery to be cultivated and exercised infinitely greater than any individual, however charismatic and endowed, could supply. Constitutionalism expresses a new mode of production. The nature of political cohesion, the nature of the public bond, is central to civic culture. It can be based in economic interest, and it can be rooted in the inheritances of pre-Republican community, cultural, ethnic, or religious. But the founding of the American Republic sought to root the civic bond in a political morality. The claims of particular goods of economic flourishing, family, and church are filtered through the moral bind of the Constitution as a claim of justice. The Constitution served to articulate the overriding claim of right. Citizenship is not only a functional political role of ruling and being ruled in turn, as Aristotle defined it, but a claim of justice as right and responsibility. The citizen is a person counted. This is a moral claim derivative from the structure of normativity delineated in the Constitution. The American Republic has served as a regulative model for a new form of politics in which independence, sovereignty, and constitution go hand in hand. There is no more frightening example of the dissolution of the regulative ideal of political modernity than the election of Donald Trump as President of the United States in November 2016. Mr. Trump was not committed to the Constitution, and indeed encouraged the riots at the Capitol in Washington as a violent attempt to challenge the transition of power, thus undermining the moral fabric of the Republic. Trump's presidency was marked by the rift he created between the sovereign and the constitutional elements of the polity. Exploiting the relative independence of the basic institutions of government, attendant upon the separation of powers, he practiced an executive of unaccountability. The separation of powers was here leveraged to a point of coarse personal whim and gain. The crisis of the flagship of modern republics signals the demise of America's exceptionalism. This is not, in my mind, a cause for celebration, but rather for a thoroughgoing anxiety regarding the safety, prosperity, and well-being of our children in the world we bequeath to them. In the opening lines of Anna Karenina, Tolstoy famously wrote that happy families are all alike. Every unhappy family is unhappy in its own way. This sad adage holds for human polities as well. The moral and civic failure of the Republican Party in the United States threatens the horizon of hope for the chances of human liberty. But the specific elements of the scores of unhappy, poor, despotic, and unjust polities in the world each call for their own analysis and diagnosis. Human communities are all too concrete and all too individual and call for attentive understanding. This analysis becomes more difficult when the horizons for change become dramatically constricted. I will turn now to my civic community, that of the State of Israel, without the comfort of my native polity, the United States. Speaking here today in Berlin before this distinguished audience, of the theological political tremors of Leviathan in the Holy Land is uncanny. Many of our teachers to whom we turn for guidance in unraveling the workings of legitimacy in our polities first confronted these issues growing up in the Weimar Republic. Leo Strauss's famous description of himself as a young man caught in the grip of the theological political problem speaks for an entire generation. Reflecting upon my own polity seems at times a disturbing confrontation with the journey of the theological political moment in modernity from Berlin to Jerusalem. My parents were born in Jerusalem as white children. There are 2 points in my city that make it a point that I make it a point not to enter. Yad Vashem, the memorial of the destruction of Jewish civilization in Europe on the one hand, and, as we say in Hebrew, lehavdil, and with all due difference, the Kotel, the western wall of the Temple Mount, on the other. These polar sacred spaces mark Jerusalem as a contemporary theological political hub of the world. It is my own protest against sovereign abuse of the sacred that comes not only at the price of violence, but also of the desecration of the divine. It is with this concern and trepidation that I share my meditation with you here today. The transposition of the theological political moment to the heart of the polity founded by secular Zionism, the Jewish movement for national self-determination, is not self-evident. It fits a pattern of modern nation-states, among them India and Algeria, following the Second World War, that have undergone a process of secular liberating revolution, followed by a religious revival and counter-revolution. My teacher, Michael Walzer, has pondered this shift, describing it as the paradox of liberation. As a social democrat committed to communitarian correctives to liberalism and to liberal nationalism, Walzer is trying to understand what went wrong, why it is that liberals fail to reproduce their complex moral posture, and why it is that national liberation yields religious, authoritarian, and oppressive transformations. And I speak from a different point because, contrary to my teacher, first of all, I'm religious. I'm Jewish religious. I grew up in the yeshiva world. I learned much more Talmud before secular studies, before I ever came to the university, and in many ways grew up into a country that it was already, after the Yom Kippur War, overtaken in a tsunami of messianic politics. This is where I grew up. And mostly I'm trying to understand why people who I grew up with, many of which are good people, turned into bad people. This is very difficult to behold, but we have to understand that if we want to take responsibility. So I want to look a bit at the machinery of right-wing messianic orthodoxy in Israel and try to understand what is it, where it situates itself relative to the secular republic. So the good starting point, I believe, is that the theological political complexity of the modern concept of sovereignty is succinctly articulated by Thomas Hobbes in his Leviathan. Taking as his point of departure the claim that covenances without the sword are but words and have no strength to secure men at all, he argues, to make their arrangement constant and lasting, human beings are in need of a common power to keep them in awe and to direct their actions to the common benefit. The only way to erect such a common power is to appoint the sovereign, whose power would inspire this awe and whose person will unite them as a body politic. And I think there's an important proviso to make about what I've seen most of my American liberal colleagues, and that is that the federal structure of the United States ensures that when one practices one's citizenship in the United States, it's never in sovereign space. It's always in the space of particular states. This is not the case in other polities, where you meet the sovereign head on. It makes for a different kind of politics, and it makes many American liberals very comfortable that they actually never meet Leviathan. They know it in theory, and they know it when federal income tax return comes in. But that's not where they practice their citizenship. This is one of the powers of the American federal polity. It's also one of its weaknesses. And therefore, such a really a great scholar like John Rawls, to whom we owe one probably the most important articulation of justice in the 20th century, really has nothing to say in theory about the state. It's sort of assumed as a backdrop that doesn't even get a word in, which to my mind is simply uncanny. But like the return of the repressed is always with a vengeance. And that's sort of what I'm dealing with today. Now, Hobbes continues then to declare that famous sentence, which I find myself writing about time and again whenever I try to reflect on our political lives. This is the generation of that great Leviathan, he says, or rather, to speak more reverently, of that mortal God, to which we owe under the immortal God our peace and defense. Why is this formula so important for Hobbes? The complex relations between three elements, power, unification, and peace, are at the heart of the covenant that makes for a common weal. Hobbes' pitch for sovereign supremacy is not only argued for in terms of utility and peace, but needs a recognition of sovereign violence as a necessary condition and abiding anchor for establishing state authority. And that keeps these elements together. But what can the idiom mortal God possibly mean? What God can be immortal? And should this be a divination of a human being or object or institution, would it be treated as a self-conscious, idolatrous moment on Hobbes' part? What is the immortal God to say of this personification? What place has the immortal God or status given this divination of the mortal God? What place has the immortal God, I take this Hobbesian rhetoric here to be calculated and purposely scandalous. Negotiating the relationship between these two gods is a theological political quandary Hobbes bequeaths to the modern sovereign state. And clarifying it is my business here today, at least to some extent. Now, what we can say is that gods do not die. They are simply newly conceived. I think this is what we learn from Heidegger's contemplation of Nietzsche's statement of the death of God. The messianic fervor of religious Zionism is led on by a redemptive sacred history. It is not a linear narrative, but a dialectical movement that knows many despairing setbacks, but is always driven on by the incisive sweep of the divine. Its subject is not the individual, but they would say the Ummah. And here's a wonderful play on Hebrew, because Ummah in modern Hebrew means nation, and not Ummah, the same cognate that the way it's used in Arabic. It is ecstatic and beatific, and all falls for the sake of the ultimate elevation. Individuals are particular and therefore insignificant, but the messianic pace knows no less than the universal stance sub specie aeternitatis. Redemptive violence is grave and pure. After all, it knows the divine and is party to the plan. I think when we look at religious Zionism, that will be our model today, is that we see that institutionalized religion does not depose the mortal God. It crowns it in the name of the immortal God. And in this way, radical religious Zionism has actually retained the Leviathan in its transposition from a declared secular polity to one adopted by the institutional religion by Orthodox ideology in the counter-revolution. And this is interesting because think about a wonderful adage, and scary adage by Rabbi Kook, the father, who died in 1935 and wrote famously in his diaries, later published under different names, our state, the state of Israel, and he's writing in 1935, long before the creation of the state, is the foundation of the throne of God in the world. Yesod kiseh malchuto ba'olam. Now, when you understand that Rabbi Kook is a Kabbalist, so he's really, then you know that Yesod is not merely foundation, but it's the divine phallus. And Kiseh Hashem ba'olam, the lowest sephirah, which is conceived as a feminine aspect of the divine, is the throne of God in the world. Now, look at the irony of this in this story, because Leviathan is taken over as a sort of Metatron of the Shekhinah, of this theosophy, and I wonder how much the people adopting this discourse and living it understand what they're doing. And I'll return to that in a moment. But adopting the structures, the theological political structures of Leviathan for its own purpose comes at the price of detaching it from constitutionalism. Why? Because now the state is conceived as the personification of the divine. As such, the civic community is turned into a religious congregation. And religious congregationalism and politics are collapsed one on the other. And what happens in Israel when this takes place, and it's not been successful in completely taking over the polity, but has a very strong resonance in the polity, is that, first of all, the only norms that the community is seen to be bound to, the religious community, are the norms of religion. Secondly, membership is a membership in the religious community. And the rules of joining are that of joining a religious community and not of civic naturalization. It can't be. And this is very powerful in the scary sense of the word, because there's really no place for others except on the understanding of classical halakha. And thirdly, what it means is that all secular communities are usually share a bond of trust. And trust here is not capitalized. It's small. It's with a small t. What that means is that when we wake up in the morning, we know that there's going to be bread in the grocery, and we know that the train is going to come on time, more or less, and we'll get to work, and our colleagues will be there, and our salary will come in on the first of the month. This is the fabric of trust. But in a religious community, faith takes the place of trust. And faith is not only in the shared God, but you can have faith in another human being to the degree that they share the faith in God. So our notions of both of membership, of sovereign authority, let's begin with this, of sovereign authority, of membership, of mutuality, are dictated by a completely different structure than that of the civic structure. And this is now coloring dramatically the politics of the State of Israel. It's not ruling the day yet, but it's certainly very predominantly there. And that's its structure. It's moved to be a theocracy. But what is the irony? And with this I'll finish. The imagery of Leviathan, which in ancient Hebrew, as in the Ugaritic language, also in other ancient Middle Eastern languages, Leviathan is a dragon. Okay, and it appears dramatically, perhaps at first full text, in the Epic of Baal in Ugarit in the 14th century before the Common Era. Okay, this is a long, long time ago, and Baal succeeds in slaying the dragon and thereby wins one of the crucial battles against Mot, the god of death. This imagery, it flows into the ancient Israelite religion, where the god named for on the Tetragrammaton, and being religious, I don't articulate the name, takes over this role of Baal, his arch enemy, to slay the great dragon. And here we see a new messianic generation conceiving of itself in an apocalyptic moment, adopting the most idolatrous presentation of Leviathan in many millennia, and presenting him as the front of the great God, and in many ways undoing probably one of the most fundamental mythological moments in our traditions. I know it's not a very enheartening vision, but we live in a sad world. Thank you.
It looks like it's not going to be a fun evening, sort of with lots of optimistic stuff. I think that one of the interesting things today is that Hobbesian distinction between the immortal and the mortal God is something that doesn't really work in the 21st century, mainly because if you look at our cultural dynamic, it tends to be about demystifying God. I mean, one of the things I've done as a sociologist is to look at the language with which God and other forms of authority are discussed. And invariably, the emphasis tends to be to question, to kind of criticize, to demystify, because there's an assumption that somehow there's something inherently flawed in any projection of authority, including that of religion. Obviously, this is not the case for distinct religious kind of communities. I find that quite fascinating, that the call to unmask authority coincides with what Menachem talked about, was the sacralization, or the attempt to sacralize politics. Because the minute you sacralize politics, what you're saying, in effect, is that the sacred has become a commodity. The sacred has become negotiable. And therefore, its inner content, the whole dynamic of transcendence and what kind of drives it, becomes fundamentally impoverished. I think that what we're seeing from all the sections of our society, from all the political movements, is this silent quest, silent search for some kind of authorization. It really hit me the other day when I was reading the latest work of Francis Fukuyama, who's now back on the circuit again, where he's basically talking about the way in which Ukraine is going to revive liberalism. It's a kind of very, sort of slightly instrumental way of perceiving the struggle that's going on there, and somehow the Ukrainians are sacrificing their lives in order to give American liberal democracy a good time and to make it kind of work again. But also, I think what's very interesting is that throughout the world, you'll find that suddenly people have been reading their Weber. They've been noticing that there is this threefold authority that I know you're all familiar with, sort of from traditional authority, religious authority on the one hand, then rational legal authority on the other hand, and finally charismatic authority. And what I find really fascinating is that almost overnight, Zelensky has emerged as this focus of authoritarian, almost like he's become a saint. And there are all these articles being written about how can a comedian suddenly mutate into this almost Christ-like figure, this kind of heroic figure that, in a sense, personifies all the virtues that seem to be distinctly lacking in the United States or in Britain or in France, where our political leaders are far more pedestrian and down to earth. And to me, and when you look at the sheer number of commentaries that have been published on that theme, you can really see there's a kind of quest for this kind of authorization. And my own interest in the subject emerged principally when, at a certain point in my life, I began to realize that the question of moral authority in particular was something that was distinctly seen as kind of marginal or impossible, or seen as having a very sort of feeble existence within various academic circles and political cultural settings. And in particular, I became very interested in the fact and that liberalism itself was quite complicit in bringing this about. Now, a lot of criticisms of liberalism are external to liberalism. In other words, they hate liberalism and they're trying to kind of undermine it and call everything into question. I'm not that kind of a critique of liberalism, because I rise from within the liberal tradition itself, and I actually think there is within, particularly Enlightenment liberalism, certain potentialities which are not always realized, are very often thwarted by liberalism's own inability to take its own principles seriously. I think that's something I find is quite important. And in particular, I think that has led to a situation where the kind of potential authorities that liberalism threw up, or forms of authorization, very rarely get realized. So if you recall, back in the old days of the Enlightenment, there's this emphasis on the individual and this individual rationality, which are seen as the polar opposites to authoritarianism. There's an emphasis on freedom. Freedom is seen as being particularly important, as important to cultivate, as a way of kind of undermining the absolutist or the authoritarian regimes. And very importantly, there's also an emphasis on individual rationality, the rationality of human beings, as somehow having an important role to play. Now, if you go through some of the most important leading members of the Enlightenment, you'll find that despite their commitment to these ideals, when push comes to shove, when they're confronted with a practical problem, sometimes a very difficult problem, it seems that those ideals very often become negotiable, and their locus for authority changes. And I'm thinking of someone like Spinoza, for example, who I love in many respects, who was at his time a far more radical Democrat than most other people, and had a certain amount of understanding how important the people were in the creation of this new republic that was being built at the time in Holland. But when confronted with the influence of the Calvinist establishment and his fear that the Calvinist establishment had an undue influence on the people, and when the Calvinist establishments began to agitate against the Republic, and the mob killed his friend John DeWitt, who was the head of the Republic at the time, suddenly we have a new Spinoza. And Spinoza, at that point in time, maybe you like that, I'm a little bit wary of that, becomes very skeptical of the people. He becomes very skeptical of the exercise of democracy. And he even goes so far as to say that I write these philosophical books not to be read by ordinary people, because more or less they're a little bit too thick to kind of grasp and understand what's really being said here. I find a very similar reaction in another one of my heroes, Immanuel Kant, who writes this fascinating thing about what is the Enlightenment, and his message to everybody is dare to know. I love that expression, dare to know. But when it comes to his deliberations on democracy and on the people, on the authority of that's gained through being legitimized by the exercise of popular sovereignty, he withdraws from that, and he very explicitly indicates that democracy is not something that is realizable or possible. I think of someone like James Mill, the father of JS, who in a wonderful speech that he's giving in the 19th century basically says, look guys, I really do believe that we don't have to worry about giving the vote to ordinary people. I don't think we should worry too much about giving them franchise, because the people will recognize that the educated people like ourselves should be trusted to give their, to influence the direction of society. He kind of puts forward this idea of deference, that people will naturally defer to us because we have the rational insights, we have science behind us. We are able to explain the complexities of the world, and people will look to us to give them leadership and guidance. And throughout the 19th century, a big debate takes place on public opinion, and the debate is basically this: we have to live with public opinion. By the 19th century, you cannot get rid of it and force people back into sort of an entirely marginal existence. But how do we control it? How do we make sure that they draw the same conclusions that we do? How do they become liberally minded? And I think it's at this point where the contradictions between liberalism and its search for authority really kick in. Because what happens is, particularly with the more aristocratic elements of liberalism, and I'm thinking of someone like Benjamin Constantin, the French kind of thinker, de Tocqueville, for example, they basically discover mass psychology, and they discover crowd psychology. And a fundamental shift occurs, at first almost imperceptibly, which is that one of the foundational norms of Enlightenment liberalism is turned upside down. Until that point, if you recall, the rational individual or individual rationality was seen as one of the main justifications for the Enlightenment movement to kind of move forward, and the belief in individual rationality was really quite important. By the end of the 19th century, from 1870 onwards, this notion becomes marginalized. And instead, people talk about the irrationality, first of the crowd, right? First of the mob, and then of the masses, mass society. And basically what you have is the devaluation of normal human beings on the grounds, and this is the argument that will be repeated until today, that ordinary people are easily manipulated by demagogues. It's an old Greek argument, but it's brought back again, and even goes on now. People are manipulated by the media, by the mass press that has been kind of put forward. They're manipulated by advertising, which manipulates their desires. And what you're left with is basically an entirely elitist conception of what society is really like. And it's only a relatively small number of rational, scientifically minded, educated liberals who are in the position to immunize themselves from a lot of these pressures. That happens in the 19th century. In the 20th century, what happens is that it's not only the crowd, it's not only the mass, but the individual. That individual's rationality and capacity to kind of exercise judgment is called into question. And from about the first decade of the 20th century onwards, what's being done is people are saying is that actually when people go and vote, they really don't know what their interest is. They really are unaware of what their ideals are really all about, and we need to do something about it. We've got to find a way around it. At this point, what happens is a new idea of authority is kind of almost like kind of experimented with, and and this is something that you can see in American progressivism. You can see this in the new liberal tradition in Britain, or in Swedish social democracy, in a number of different settings, where basically what you have is an attempt to authorize the social engineer, authorize the technocrat, and in some shape or form, through authorizing those individuals, you hope that some kind of authority can be normalized in that kind of a way. I think it's interesting that someone like John Dewey himself, basically in a number of his articles and essays, shows a degree of skepticism about people's capacity to be rational agents, and actually refers to the need to educate them in entirely technocratic terms, where he talks about both moral engineering and social engineering as a way of dealing with this sort of particular problem. So the long, in a sense, the long road from Enlightenment to our times, becomes increasingly one where the basis for a liberal kind of authority becomes increasingly impossible to achieve, because if you're calling into question many of your foundational norms, you're going to face a crisis of normativity. And how do you resolve this crisis of normativity? What do you actually do in those kinds of circumstances? Well, I think what tends to happen increasingly is you try to create two forms of authority. One is the authority of the expert and the social engineer in relation to that. And secondly, it's the authority of the rule of law. They're the two refuges that are, in a sense, kind of constructed. In the case of John Dewey, he basically adopted a kind of social engineering element where, through the action of the state, you're going to create a better world for the rest of society, and hopefully, in the course of that, more and more people will become educated so that they can begin to see what is in their rational interests. In the current era, and this has been going on for some time, there's been also an attempt by some liberals to create an emphasis on the rule of law. And there's been an attempt to overcome the problem that Max Weber pointed out, which is that legal rational authority necessarily lacks moral depth. In other words, people don't get up in the morning and they get turned on by the law, right? Unless you're a legal scholar, this is not very interesting for you in terms of motivating you in terms of everyday life. So there's a kind of lack of moral kind of depth and the capacity to stir people's emotion and make the connections that are necessary in any meaningful system of authority. And not all law is like that, because historically we know that customary law had that moral depth, and even in the English tradition, common law, because these were legal norms that emerged organically from the experiences of those communities. But the law, in the sense that it becomes increasingly procedural, sort of fails to do that, and something that even Habermas recognized when he argued that you cannot create laws or norms administratively, because they really, if you kind of invent them in these new kinds of norms, they have very little relationship to what had been, what preceded it. You're going to have a big problem. Speaking of Leviathan, there's a very interesting book. I don't know if any of you had a chance to read it. I was shocked. I don't get shocked. I'm so old now that nothing really shocks me, you know, sort of. But when I read a book by Cass Sustain and Adrian Vermeulen, it's called The Law and Leviathan, Redeeming the Administrative State. I don't know, you probably all know who Sustain is. He was in the Obama administration. He's the guy that invented nudge, you know, where you basically nudge people to do things that they wouldn't do otherwise. He calls it Libertarian Paternalism. I love that phrase, Libertarian Paternalism, which obviously is a bit of a contradiction in terms. And basically, in their argument for redeeming the administrative state, and the book was only published a year and a half ago or 2 years ago, they basically tried to argue that the law inherently has got a moral component to it. It's inherently a moral, it's almost like a quasi-sacred religious phenomenon, which because of its moral content, which they want to argue, can provide the solution to the old problem of authority. But how do they go about, and what do they do? Well, having indicated that the law has got this moral content to it, they basically then react to it by opting for a policy of nudging, where we basically tell people or manipulate people to doing things rather than doing that overtly. But they also, and this is where the shocking element comes in, they also begin to talk about the necessity of somehow and sometimes doing something that is a little bit more coercive than nudging. And they call it cognitive infiltration. Again, a very lovely term, cognitive infiltration, which in the old days when I was young used to be called brainwashing, sort of, simple brainwashing. But, these guys have all these, they're also conceptual engineers, like some other people. And they basically then go about developing a technocratic form of authority with a quasi-sacred moralizing emphasis on the law, believing that will, deal with the issue. But the point I want to make about all these different attempts is that, for better or worse, their confusions about the authority of authority leads to a situation where they bypass the need, and this is something that we all need to do, they bypass the need for dealing explicitly with the question of normativity. I think that is a question that we cannot continually refuse to engage with and say it's not important, it's too difficult, it's not what liberals should be really doing. And I think what happens is that increasingly liberalism acquires illiberal dimensions. I'm glad to see there's a new journal from Washington that's just started this year or late last year called Studies of Illiberal Liberalism. And when they talk about illiberalism, they're talking about the right-wing form, but there's also a liberal form of illiberalism, which kind of comes out in a number of different ways. I think that, in particular in America, liberalism has acquired some distinctively illiberal instincts, for example, with speech, where if you look at most studies or surveys that have been carried out, one by the New York Times just very recently, on free speech, they show that liberals have a much more skeptical attitude towards its desirability than any other section of society. I think what's also happened is that increasingly, as a way of forcing people to accept the authority of the rule of law and also of technocratic expertise, there's been a growing tendency to criminalize spontaneity, and spontaneity is now subjected to a whole number of formal and informal rules. And you all know the more rules we make, the more there's a demand for even more rules as a result of that. Responding to the illiberal turn of liberalism, Mark Lila, professor of humanities, has warned what he sees as the danger of liberalism becoming wedded to illiberal identity politics. And he observed that in recent years, American liberalism has slipped into a kind of moral panic about racial, gender, and sexual identity that has distorted liberalism's message and prevented it from becoming a unifying force capable of governing. I mean, Lila is right to highlight this problem, but I do think that the issue of values and of normativity are something that both preceded it and also really quite important on this. Now, just to end on what I'm trying to sort of basically argue, I think that one of the challenges for liberalism is to be able to reconcile the aspiration for human autonomy. I think autonomy has got a bad press recently, and it's seen as just being narrow, selfish individualism, not realizing that autonomy has got contained within it the idea of self-determination, everything from bodily autonomy to also moral autonomy. So we've got to reconcile the aspiration for human autonomy with the exercise of authority. I think that even today in the 21st century, individual freedom is unfortunately perceived to be directly counterposed to authority. However, experience shows that when authority exists in a feeble form, individual freedom is also compromised. In other words, you cannot have a free society that's totally free if authority is fragile and weak. It doesn't, the two go, it kind of contradicts each other, and the two go hand in hand in a sense. And that's why I think what happens is that when you have the diminishing of authoritative behavior in public life, it tends to be paralleled by the disorientation of the private sphere. I think that one of the things that I'm coming to realize, and it's a point that I find very difficult to accept, and I could be really wrong on this, but it's something that I struggle with all the time, is this. Hannah Arendt, in one of her little essays, makes the point that freedom is one of those flowers that blooms very, very rarely. You know, living freely is not something that is given to us all the time. You know, when it does, it's a buzz. You know, it's nice that, you know, there is that, but it's very rare that freedom, you know, becomes the norm, living freely in her sense of the word. And similarly, I think, when you look back at our experience, authority, in terms of its moral content, in terms of its exercise of moral authority, is also something that tends to elude us most of the time. But when it exists, you know how important it is. And going back to Zelensky, when you see, whatever you think of the struggle in the Ukraine, when you see someone like Zelensky doing the business and behaving in a particular way, you do become aware of the fact that most of the time, on most days, we're missing something very, very important. Thank you.
Thank you very much for these two very inspiring talks that somewhat complemented each other. Menachem, that started to use Hobbes and a particular phrase in Hobbes as a key to interpreting a current situation in the US and also in Israel, and then Frank picking up on Hobbes and in his thoughts that led him, though, into a very different direction in a certain way, I see, because if I've understood you correctly, Menachem, you said that you just that you see a certain threat of sacralization and nationalization in the US with the Trump movement, which is basically a populist movement and a populist turnover of the Republican Party and the Republican voters for Trump to a certain degree. And on the other hand, Frank was saying that there is a certain tendency, a criticism of the, or a devaluation of the people by turning them into a mob or telling them that they are uneducated or not capable of a political rationale. So how do you see, I mean, how would you react to each other in concerning the actual political situation in the US today that you were explicitly referring to, and you, Frank, indirectly in a certain way too, I think. Yeah.
Oh, wow.
Thank you. Well, I didn't use the word populist.
You don't need it? Okay, thank you. This is enough. Okay. I'm wired in. Thank you. I didn't use the word populist. I don't think that helps us in analyzing. I completely agree, and that I feel that our talks were complementary, because I think that the conditions of normativity, that moral and civic agency are predicated upon two things. One, what Rawls calls the circumstances of justice, and the second is normativity. Normativity is the capacity to understand, act, and interpret a certain conception, a certain range of norms. And basically what I try to do is to show how constitutional structures, or that a constitutional structure of the Republic is a very specific form of creating the rules of the game in a republic, both with regard to redistribution, with regard to, let's say, distribution, redistribution, and meaningful action. And the point is not so much that the polity has been sacralized, but actually that this is the deepest form of secularization of religion that you can imagine. So I would take this completely, and I think that I would also join in saying that liberalism is not a morality. Liberalism is an understanding of political, of operating as a moral agent within a polity. And I think that part of the false consciousness of liberalism as an ideology is this assumption that civil society operates without a state. The backgrounding of the state, almost to its disappearance in the consciousness of many people who are acting as citizens, comes with a price. Comes with a price when you're surprised when states wage war. Yes, that's what they do. And the weakness of the forms of liberalism we see is this notion that you can have an unanchored civic morality that's floating in the air. So this is not a powerful morality. This is, I think, almost a self-delusionary moral position. It's not because I'm not I do think of myself as a kind of liberal, and like Frank said, the third chapter of the groundwork for the metaphysics of morals is and the notion of autonomy is for me crucial. But I think that now I think that this is not only a question of. I think there are problems in the American form of liberalism that have to do with what I said, that the arena of sovereign politics is not immediately available to most citizens. You very rarely demonstrate in Washington. That happens at certain critical moments. But those are almost revolutionary moments in the United States, exactly because, I can tell you the difference. I live in Jerusalem. In Jerusalem, once a week you can't, beside all the other problems, you can't drive because there's a big demonstration. Someone's demonstrating. Someone's unhappy, and they come to tell the parliament that we're unhappy. But you don't do that in Washington except in great occasions. By the way, I think that's also what's in the background of American political assassinations also. The peculiar quality of American political assassinations. Very different from other polities, but I think I've said enough.
Yeah, I mean, just to go back to the question, at the risk of being really unpopular, I think that the term populism has been really misunderstood, and it's been detached from its historical roots. You have to remember that historically populism was I suppose what you call a left wing, a more left wing than a right wing form of outlook. And you have to remember that in the 19th century, it was amongst the white people in the United States, it was the populists who were the most open to the idea of black and white people struggling alongside of each other. And you have to remember that there are the wobblies in the 20th century. So historically, trade unionism and various other things were integral to a populist outlook, because what populism really is all about is a demand for a voice. It's a demand to be part of the conversation. And that demand, I think, has got a very creative and potentially transformative dimension. Now, that doesn't mean to say that that demand for voice cannot acquire grotesque forms sometimes. And sometimes it can go in entirely what we would see as being in the wrong directions, because people then find ways of looking for their voice in very unhelpful kind of ways. But that's not the problem of what is foundational to populism, which is the demand for voice. That's the problem, that populism is not being influenced by people like ourselves in some circumstances. So my vision, and what I would like to see happen, is a situation where on the one hand, populism rescues liberalism by providing an antidote to its slightly one-sided elitist imagination. And at the same time, liberalism gives populism a much more freedom, individually oriented, tolerant, enlightenment orientation. Because unless we think that enlightenment values are only for a very small number of people, and that other people are just too stupid to kind of grasp them, we have to believe in the fact that in some way or another, through struggles, through intellectual engagement, it is possible, because there are examples in human history where this has happened, for populism to acquire what is a genuinely liberal, but at the same time popular sort of expression. So that's really, for me, the key to overcoming liberalism's unease with authority, because at that point, in the fusion of these two, you create the basis for legitimizing political and governmental action, because people are able to consent in a way that isn't a forced kind of consent, but comes out of their experience. Now, you might say, I'm being a little bit utopian or naive or whatever, but a little bit of utopia in the 21st century, a little bit of naivety, as long as it's balanced by other considerations, will not go amiss.
Thank you. The floor is open for discussion, so please lift your hands. Asher first, and then Jose Casanova.
Thank you very much to both of you for really interesting lectures. And I have questions, if I may, for each one of you. Brief questions. My first to Menachem. Menachem, I think you introduced a very important term in the context of authority, and that's trust. We haven't really talked about this up until now. And it seems that you try to depict a path from trust to faith. And these are two terms that you mentioned. And so that actually what's happening in Israel today is there's a move to faith. Now, as you're well aware, many of the very teachers from the Weimar years, Jewish philosophers, tried to argue that trust and faith in Judaism are actually one and the same thing. That emunah is trust, and that faith is something very different. So I was wondering how you use the term faith as a political concept as you try to unpack this shift towards messianism in present-day Israel. My question for Frank, you lecture, I do have some qualms with your Spinoza interpretation. I think there's a robust defense of democracy in Spinoza, as I would argue, but that's for another conversation over a glass of wine. But I wonder, at the end of your lecture, you seem to engage in a project of recovering autonomy. And autonomy also as a response to kind of the illiberal, what you describe as illiberal tendencies of liberalism. My question, in this process of recovery of autonomy, what happens to the term responsibility? What role does that play in rescuing liberalism?
You want to go first? Go first.
All right. Yeah, I know that, I mean, when you look at the literature on autonomy, the recent one, it's invariably critical of the idea. They usually attach the term myth, the myth of autonomy. And they basically make fun of the idea that somehow moral autonomy, can have any real meaning, and particularly for people who are poor and powerless. And I think that's a position I would want to argue against. I'm not going to do it here because it will take a bit of time. But I think the reason why recovering autonomy is so important is because one of the big, sort of faux pas of liberalism has been is complicit in trying to weaken and erode the distinction between private and public life. And I think that's foundational to a liberal society, that these two spheres really exist. And Hannah Arendt was very much concerned about this. She wrote about the fact that even the pre-political sphere, which once upon a time used to have a degree of autonomy from, kind of wider influences, is now becoming subjected to experts. I go to America sometimes, or go to Canada or other places, and there are more, sort of relationship experts than rats. I mean, you have, mentors, professional mentors, you have life coaches, you have parenting experts, you have sex therapists. I mean, literally, you cannot do anything in human life without somebody telling you how to do it. And that kind of invasion of the pre-political sphere has meant that liberalism, has lost some of its most valuable resources, which is the role of individual rationality and spontaneity. I think that was mentioned this morning in some of the discussions around Hannah Arendt, which are really critical for the exercise of agency, because it's in the private sphere that we repair ourselves to make it possible for us to play a more active and dynamic life in the public sphere.
Okay, I owe you an answer, Asha. That's an intriguing question, and usually when I teach Jewish theology in Rome, I have to explain at some point to my Christian students that what it means that faith is not an organizing category for for many Jewish people in their lives. They don't even know what it would mean in the sense, in the precise sense that it's used as a translation of pistis in the New Testament. But I think that what's happened is that an entire generation in Israel has constructed a eschatological and apocalyptic framing for Jewish life in Israel. And that's something you can only take on faith. Why this is worthy of any faith is, I think, highly questionable. But it is a faith category, and it's this is the point where you see not only eschatological narratives like that of the right-wing messianism, but think about how the popularization of Nachman of Breslav's form of Hasidism, which is all around the concept of faith. And I think it returns to something that we spoke about before, that Frank mentioned, the sense that you're counted is so important for people, and rightfully. Acknowledgement is much more important than knowledge. And faith comes in for many people in Israel. And I think not only Jews, Muslims too, looking for the framework in which they will be counted. So this, I think you're right to point out that this is a dramatic shift in terms of theological political virtues in this polity. Absolutely.
Thank you so much for two very suggestive presentations and also very complementary. I was intrigued by how you complemented from very different perspectives, Kim. What I heard is that you were concerned about the disaggregation of things we've taken for granted, that they go together. But if we look back to the 19th century, most liberals were anti-democrats, most Democrats were anti-liberals, and you had a very nice administrative Rechtsstaat, Prussia, rule of law, that was neither liberal nor Democrat. And now what we see that these three principles of majority rule without consideration for the liberties, or basically libertarianism without consideration for equality, and precisely the rejection of constitutionalism, because sometimes law has been so juridified that democratic policies are not possible anymore. Plus, of course, the crisis of every democracy because of global processes. So I think we have to really, really think about disaggregating those things and how they need to be put together again, but differently than they were in the past. Mm-hmm. And if we think that those things are simply go together naturally, this is something that just happened in the post-World War period, and it's a unique, precise moment for it. So I think that this is part of the thing. The other thing that struck me is the issue of normativity. This is an issue which I'll bring tomorrow together, because I think this is the blindness spot in Weber's typology, right? If you compare the tripartite typology of types of domination, which in German Herrschaft is much harsher than authority. I mean, Parsons translated this authority, but we have to think about the difference between authority and domination. Authority is normative. And of course, Weber had difficulties. Even where he talks of bourgeois revolutions in the city, he calls it non-legitimate domination. The chapter on the city has the subtitle non-legitimate domination. And he kind of think of the fourth emptiest part of value normativity, right? So it's regression. I mean, if you have the three typologies are, right, traditional, habituel, affective, charismatic, legal rational is vague rationalität, and then vert rationalität, which will be, of course, normativity. But he didn't believe in the possibility of normativity being rationalized or universalized. So yes, this is precisely what we need to work on, but how I don't know.
It's your turn, please.
Yes. Thank you for your presentations. So I have one question for each of you. Professor Lorberbaum, I'm not sure, from your perspective, is the American Constitution still viable in our day and age? And Professor Furedi, I'd like to ask you, what is your take on the populism on the left, the Sanders kind, perhaps also the Mélenchon variant in France?
Question to Menachem. You mentioned regulative ideal, and later you spoke about how liberalism, you think, presupposes a kind of a moral agency. And my question is, how would you relate to a kind of a different story of liberalism that is shared by maybe Walter Benjamin, Freud, Derrida, and Balibar? That the very core of state constitution in liberalism presupposes a kind of a primitive violence that is then checked by a kind of state violence, and in a way that the story of liberalism is a kind of impossibility to go out of this circularity of one violence that checks another violence, and this story is very different, or it has a very different presupposition from what I think or seem to be presupposed, but by your presentation. Just one more sentence to be more precise. I think about how in Hobbes, to enter into a state, you are subjected by fear, and the maintenance of state is preserved by fear. How in Rousseau, if you're not free, you will be coerced to be free. How in Hegel, history and state is the very conversion of this one primitive violence to a kind of state violence. You mentioned we're surprised when there are violence, but in this different story, violence power is very inherent to the very emergence of state constitution. And to close, the question is how would you relate to this different story of the relationship between sovereignty and state constitution? Thank you.
One last question, and then you have closing.
I won't remember. I'm sorry. I want to get. I'm sorry. I want to try to. Both are connected. I don't think that states free us from violence. What states hold out for us, whether liberal or not, is the possibility of redistribution. States are the most important agents of redistribution today. There's nothing better. If you think you can propose something better, if you think Walter Benjamin can propose something better, which he didn't, we'd be the first to listen. He doesn't suggest. And that's easy. That's very easy. Mostly, one of the civic problems of adopting Benjamin or Derrida as a starting point for politics from a very non-political ethic is that it inspires people to sit on the sidelines of their polity because they don't want to get dirty. Politics is about dirty hands. But the question is, what kind of checks and balances we can put on our dirty hands? And here there are two different things. I think that as Hobbes says, I think wisely, scarce has there been a commonwealth in the world whose foundation can be in good conscience justified. This is true. I don't know of a polity in the world that has not been created by shedding of blood, A, which is not to justify it, and B, creating a polity means making a very strong decision on who's in and who's out. Those are not self-evident decisions. That's why constitutions are crucial. Now, does that mean that they don't have faults? They have faults. But I think that polities are judged not by their pre-political moment, because if you assume, as I do, that justice is the first virtue of social institutions, then the justice of a polity is measured by what standards it will create to incorporate the outcomes of its founding violence. The idea that there could be a politics without violence seems to me strange. I'm not condoning it. I spent my life picking up the pieces. But I think that the point is, and this is why I translated Leviathan to Hebrew, because it was published during the Second Intifada. And I thought that what Hobbes explains or tries to think about is how we might create a better life by looking human violence straight in the face and not denying it. So beginning with Hobbes is not only to point out the idolatrous moments in the modern polity, but asking the question that Hobbes, I think, was asking himself. Is it possible, after decades of the state of nature, as he calls it, which means civil war, to create some kind of functional polity? This, I think, is the real challenge of politics. Of course, if someone, I think I would join you completely in saying that part of the naivete of non-political liberalism is this. We spoke about Kant's metaphors. You know, the most devastating metaphor is purity. People have heard me before. You want to be pure, go to the mikveh. That's not what morality or working is about. So I'm not condoning violence, and I'm not being naive about it. But this is the work of politics. The work of politics is how to create a common weal. Is that at all possible? And to say, let me also show the other side of the coin. The other side of the coin is, listen, today, I think part of the unraveling of the modern republic has to do with the fact that when Hobbes is imagining Leviathan and creates the theory of the modern state, which I don't know a state that's working without it, what he's assuming is that states are the greatest generators of power there is. I think that technology in the past 50 years has given the kind of destructive power that once only states had to sub-political units. Now, what does this mean? What this means is that you can exercise dramatic destructive power without any responsibility to creating a political economy. And this is one of the things we see with our own eyes today. How to create a political economy where you can have some kind of measure of distribution and redistribution to support forms of life. And to continue, I think that the point isn't just to show their violence, but to ask ourselves the question of what kind of structures can we create? Morality for me is about making tough decisions all the time. And if we stand on the sideline and say, oh, I don't want to get dirty, I'm not going to participate in bloodshed, which I don't think we should. It's not enough. It's not enough. More has to be said. More has to be said. Otherwise, there's no difference between Kant and Machiavelli, because both are absolutely sure that as soon as they have found out what must be done, they have a carte blanche. And I think that this is not only makes for bad politics, I think it makes for dramatic moral irresponsibility.
Can I just come in on that? I think I'm with Machiavelli on some of these issues because, contrary to his reputation, he recognized the importance of what he called the wisdom of the masses as being an important element in the equation, something that's been missed out by a lot of liberals since then. I think there's also another Hobbes, and the other Hobbes is somebody who's writing in the aftermath or in the middle of the Civil War. Is completely, feels insecure about an unprecedented degree of instability, insecurity, and violence. And this is not in the Leviathan, but in the Behemoth, he writes about, where does the problem come from? And the problem comes from the universities. It comes from these traveling pamphleteers, who are daring to question a variety of different things. And he's really worried about the fact that somehow there's all these subversive ideas that have come into play. And his then Leviathan is an attempt to somehow contain that. And I think what's interesting, and this relates to Menachem's point, is that in the 21st century, with social media and technology and everything else, it is not possible to even dream of containing, even poor old Putin cannot actually control the social media. Even he is going to be able to deal with something like that. So I think under those circumstances, where I think, and I do agree that Hobbes's thinking is very suggestive and is very kind of creative. I think that for me, the point I would kind of really draw out is we have to understand that the state by itself can become just merely an institution with its own inner dynamics without any real responsibility. And that therefore the question becomes, what is the guarantee of freedom and democracy? And in my book, it's not the Constitution, although constitutions are important. It's not any particular institution. It's not a benevolent or wise government. And then the only guarantee that we have is the maturity of the people, of the citizens. I think it's the citizens in the end that are the only ones that are able to contain some of the tendencies that come into being. And I am worried about, I think your comment and a comment over there, I think we don't want to read history backwards. And it's very, very kind of tempting to say, well, already in the 19th century before, these things were in play. And therefore, I'm not saying you're saying that, but therefore, they become inevitable, that somehow within liberalism, there is this inherent flaw that was in existence beforehand. And similar arguments are used about the Enlightenment. There's all these books about how the Holocaust was the inevitable consequence of Enlightenment. I think that's a very theological way of seeing the situation. Mm-hmm. And I think that what we need to do is use the wisdom of the past and go back to I think the 19th century is very, very important. but try to see whether we can reappropriate what was very good about it and make our own contribution to it in light of the specific circumstances that we're in. And the one thing that neither one of us discussed, but is the elephant in the room, is the idea of transcendence, which at least minimally somehow any kind of authority has got to engage with.
We are running out of time, but there was still this one question about populism from the left.
Oh, sorry, Mélenchon. If I was in France, I would have voted for Mélenchon because even though I don't agree with him on a lot of things, at least he raised some very interesting questions. I think that the movement of the Yellow Vest is a very good example of what we're talking about. It had its good bits and its bad bits, and that shows you. In France, you have genuine populist impulses. So Menachem talked about how in Jerusalem there's a demonstration every week. When I go to France, my wife and I love going to France because we get to Calais, and within a few days we bump into a demonstration, and it brings back memories from my youth. It's just nice to see people being angry and demanding, and you know that these are people who take themselves really, really seriously. And for them, this is an important blow for freedom. So I think, yeah, definitely, France is very interesting. But at the same time, I think we've got to be very important. It's very important that we don't entirely caricature grotesquely the movement that's behind Le Pen. We've got to understand why it is that former Communist Party members and former Communist Party regions, like Pas-de-Calais and all these areas, have went from the PCF to Le Pen. We've got to really understand why that is in order to understand what can be done to engage with populism in a more creative kind of way.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Great talks for the discussion. And there's wine and snacks outside, and we can continue the conversation.
Thank you.